Volume 3 Chapter 38. What fresh nightmare is this? Hecate shouted and snatched up her spear, forcing herself, weary as she was, first to rush out of the hut to find her people screaming in alarm. It can't be more undead. It can't be. It wasn't. Everyone seemed fine, but the cause of their screaming quickly became obvious. Just beyond the breaches in the walls, a thing she'd only ever heard stories about, dominated the water. Is that ice? Hecate wondered as she looked at the still white ground that had once been the ebbing flow of water. The red bloody surface had become red-stained and still, while the rest was either dirty or as white as the purest and most perfect of clouds. Several of her people were howling and screaming, "I'm stuck! I'm stuck! Please! I'm stuck! Comrades! Help me!" Cries of fear and pain were rampant, and before the cries could rise higher she understood just why. The ones working deeper. The water froze around them. Hecate pointed her spear toward the area beyond the damaged wall. "If you're not stuck, go help the others. When someone unsticks you, go aid them in helping others. Use rocks, spears, anything," she shouted and rushed out, her powerful leaps carrying her over the wall to find that at least a dozen of her own were flailing about, waist-high or worse in the now solid surface of the lake. They pounded with their fists and ignored the breaking of their fingers. Hecate didn't blame them. Frogmen did not fare well in the ice. Around her, to their credit, the frogmen were following her commands. Clubs swung down hard to crack at the ice, while others chipped at ice with knives, and enterprising souls rushed out to take up swords that were piled high from the dead humans, and applied those to the task of freeing their brethren. There was no way for Hecate to tell how many were trapped in the ice, but there were many, and the cruel cold which would have melted on its own eventually, began to take its toll on those who had the misfortune to be standing in it at the time. Hecate brought her spear down and smashed through, freeing one of her followers in a single blow. Her heavy infantry were doing the same, but others of more common strength struggled at their task. Sometimes the scream changed its tune, going to a higher octave when a blow missed the ice and struck flesh instead, adding to the total tally of the wounded that was already too much for Hecate to truly grasp. But thanks to steady order and quick actions, 1 became 2, then became 5, then 10, and the numbers of those helping free the remainder became sufficient that the whole tribe was set completely free of the dreadful substance in a few hours. What was that? Somebody asked their queen, to which Hecate answered that was something called ice. I've heard of it, but never seen it up close. The dwarven merchants told me their mountains get this stuff on top of it, but frozen water. Who could freeze so much? Nobody answered that either. Will I ever get one of my questions answered? She wondered, and ironically she had no answer to that either. The luckiest frogmen had only mild burns from the freezing around their ankles, and though they were in pain, they could still move and work, albeit with some wincing. Others, however, had more serious burns all over most of their body, and they were left groaning and in pain. A few unfortunates had hands and feet both frozen into place when picking something out of the water. Worse yet, when the last tally was told, 6 more had died. They had been frozen at the head, breaking the surface of the water when the freeze hit. Frozen where they were, their brain could not take the change, and their struggling ceased long before anyone could see they were in danger, leaving them mere frozen corpses waiting to be released. Hecate mounted the wall and stood above the center where she had fought before and looked off into the distance over the now solid white waters. Over the distant waters, she could have sworn her eyes beheld dots. No. She whimpered to herself. No more. Just no more. The whispered plea to the gods went unanswered, and the dots remained atop the frozen surface. That is why the waters were frozen. So that whoever did it, could walk here. The dread of that understanding sent Hecate into a desperate tailspin of thinking. We've been getting the evacuees back all day. Can they find the strength to run again? How long before those dots get here? What about our young? Hecate acutely felt the lack of options open to her in the present moment. If they fled, survival was uncertain. If they remained, survival was uncertain. If they fought, survival was uncertain. Fight. Don't fight. Maybe we can surrender. The lizardmen couldn't have done this, so that means some other enemy has. Perhaps I can persuade them to join us instead. Hecate clung to that thought. They were far away at least, giving them some time to rest. She looked over her shoulder. Withdraw to warmth. Eat. Rest. All non-combatants set to rebuild their defenses. Get someone to take the young to safety? She considered the order, but then she had to ask herself. How? Where? Carrying so many eggs was impossible, and they would just attract more monsters, and enough guards to protect them all would mean they might as well all go together, and still there was the ugly question of where. Behind her, she could hear her people flopping down in various places. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be something, and in the meantime her non-combatants went about the work process, rebuilding the walls where the undead breached it before, running fresh vines back and forth between trees to create the barriers again. There was little else to be done, and to her pride, her people were doing all that they could. So Hecate stood on the wall, and waited. Volume 3 Chapter 39. My lord? Zarayasu asked when the distant walls came into view. We could settle this for you. Let us be your sword today. It was a bold proposal from the chief who, without thinking and without it even occurring to the others to object, took the front and center position. They may be stronger than your numbers still, Ainz cautioned the lizardman at his back. You will be behind us, my lord. Let us prove to you we are not a burden. If we run into trouble, it is enough for us to know you will be along to help. Plus the sooner we get there, the sooner your august self can tend to more important matters. Zarayasu suggested, and when the lizardman pointed that out, Shaltia turned a hopeful gaze up to her lord. Ainz felt that compelling, longing look from his guardian. Let them handle the bugs, my lord. You can collect the spoils after. Shaltia pointed out. Ainz nodded at long last. Follow them then, let them do the fighting. Only involve yourself if there are any champions capable of turning the tide. You are their trump card, Shaltia. My lord, Shaltia said with pride, and when Zarayasu conveyed the words of their master, a war cry went up from the masses, ready to engage the hated frogman. Fly. Ainz uttered the spell. I will be watching over you, he said with godlike charm and began to ascend toward the sky. A god watches over us. We must not fail. Shajiryu uttered the admonition and the lizardman army advanced across the frozen lake, the chiefs falling in on either side of Shaltia bloodfallen. So how will you fight this anyway? Shaltia asked while the ice crunched under her dainty little feet. We chiefs will control the flow of battle from the rear and then go in where there is trouble. Shajiryu explained, clapping his brother on the shoulder. Hit frogman to death. Cuckoo punched one fist into the other. I will handle the mages and ranged combat in support. Crush Lulu added. So you put some thought into this? Shaltia admitted somewhat begrudgingly. Yes, Lady Shaltia, the lake is not new to war. Though nothing this large has ever happened before. Zarayasu admitted. All right, then. A delightful thought came to Shaltia. I will watch. If you run into real trouble, say only long live Ainz Ulgaun and I will help you. Long live Ainz Ulgaun. The chiefs chanted with soft reverence. Above the lizardman, Ainz watched, with a mix of worry and curiosity. Shaltia was with them, and though it was unlikely, he couldn't help but fear that somehow she might be injured. Imagining her small, frail-looking little body in any pain at all, it filled him with anxiety that set his whole body on edge. She could likely ruin whole nations without so much as having a nail clipped, and yet I worry over her like a father watching his little girl ride a bicycle without training wheels for the first time. Ainz could only roll his eyes at his own absurdity. Still, knowing it was absurd and ridding himself of the worrisome fatherly feelings over his children were two very different things, and he found the worry remained as the distance closed between the forces. I could end it all with one spell. But perhaps this is better. Shaltia will gain some experience while the lizardman will reveal something of their present abilities. It was comforting in a way, to know he should do nothing, and it helped him cope with his worry over Shaltia's safety. The distance shrank far quicker than he expected it to, or at least so it felt, and so, he waited. To the wall, Hecate yelled after she'd given her people all the rest that they could. Lizardmen were now clearly visible, and her forces still weary and worn down. The mana of her casters was still too low, but her forces obeyed their queen to the fullest of their ability. They went to the wall and made ready, some bearing swords taken from the undead, but most stuck with the familiar spears or more recently adopted clubs. Lizardmen. Those are lizardmen. One of her warriors shouted in utter disbelief. He bounced up and down, restraining the urge to leap toward the invaders and attack. They are. They must be behind this somehow. Hecate muttered, but at their center there was one very clear figure in red who was obviously not a lizard man. A pale human-looking knight with a long lance in crimson-colored armor that exudes power. That must be the caster responsible. The one responsible for all our calamities. That one must die. Hecate vowed, but aware of her delicate circumstances, when they came within shouting distance, she tried to negotiate with the stranger. "Stop there!" Hecate called out, "I'm willing to negotiate." The ranks stopped when the armored figure raised her hand. Oh? The figure had a voice Hecate could vaguely place as female. "Yes," Hecate shouted, "tell me what it is you want, perhaps we can meet halfway." "Really?" The young-looking smooth skin in armor shouted back. "Really?" Hecate shouted, her back erect and spear planted firmly on the wall. She held out her free hand with the webbed palm upturned. "I'm telling the truth." "So you really want to negotiate?" the Red Knight asked again. Hecate felt her eyeballs twitch. "I do. I really do," she shouted back. Her warriors at her back and at her side were staring up at her. She glanced down at them. She knew that they knew what she knew. "We are not in a position of strength." Many were dead, many more were wounded, their eggs were vulnerable, everyone was needed at the wall. "The lizardmen will not show mercy to us. Not now." Hecate vaguely felt regret at her harsh treatment of the captives and for her promise of eradicating them. "I have lizardman prisoners at another camp, I will set them free as a token of goodwill," Hecate shouted the promise. "No you don't. The lizardmen already killed everyone there and set your prisoners free," the Red Knight shouted back. "I still want to negotiate," Hecate shouted. "That's nice." The Red Knight shouted back and raised her lance with the tip toward the sky. "But I don't." Hecate felt a chill down her spine as the lance was lowered toward her walls. Whatever the Red Knight said to the lizardman after that, Hecate missed it, but it was enough to get the lizardman to charge. Volume 3 Chapter 40. Negotiate. How silly. Shiltea thought and felt the army at her back grow tense with anticipation. "That's nice," she shouted back at the big frog lady, "but I don't." She all but cackled at her answer and lowered her lance toward the wall. "Go on, get even. But leave a few alive as a tribute to our lord." Crush Lulu shouted her orders and her magic casters launched fireballs toward the walls. Even from where she stood, it was obvious that the glorious days of yesterday or earlier were gone. They were weakened, weary, and some of those on the wall still had obvious small wounds on their bodies. They leaned on spears rather than standing proudly at the ready, as the big one did. Flames roared forward, arcing overhead to crash into the walls. Frogmen leapt away from the flames, diving behind cover with their powerful fear-fueled legs. At her back, Crush Lulu heard the shout of, "Magic arrow," and frogmen began to tumble from the wall. Frogmen magic casters had yet to respond, but the albino lizard woman had little hope that this would remain the case forever. Cuckoo bellowed an angry roar and charged ahead. His white bone armor was attention getting in the best of times, and coupled with his angry roaring and furious charge, he drew missile fire from every corner that could reach him before the frogmen realized their spears were just not enough by themselves to draw blood. The weary warriors of the frogmen were heavy-limbed and slow, but they had the high ground on the walls, and whether Zariasu wanted to admit it or not, he was compelled to acknowledge that they were brave, even fearless. The sound of voices activating warrior arts was punctuated by the cries of slaughterers and the slaughtered, the shout so loud and ferocious that the sprays of blood were buffeted farther away from the wall than force alone allowed. The frogmen were clearly much reduced in numbers, and their martial arts had begun to flag. The tide of fighting went back and forth at the low walls. Howls, ribbits and hisses of pain or fury went on while the two sides tore at one another. Again. Crush Lulu shouted and held her hand commandingly out from her body, sending another wave of magical blasts that tore into the ranks of the frogmen on the wall. Some fell down, pierced through and through by magic arrows that hit hard enough to carry their bodies back onto their fellows waiting. But fearless enemies jumped to take the place of their comrades, regardless of the stones that flew from slings to pierce their brains. All was chaotic and madness, with no gate to batter down. The lizardmen hacked at the wall or climbed over each other to mount and fight claw to hand, club to club, or spear to spear. The few frogmen to pick up swords found that they were less useful than they hoped, requiring more skill to use despite their greater sharpness, and so they threw the swords down at lizardmen and chose to revert to their spears instead. Heads jabbed up and down, and the fighting teetered back and forth between the press of both sides until the big one holding the strongest point taunted the ranks of the chiefs behind the lizardmen and bellowed out. Behold the chiefs of the lizardmen. They hide while your queen stands with you. Will you let her die here, protecting your own young from cowards?" Invigorated by her projected voice, the frogmen struggled on, the bodies of defeated frogmen falling before the walls, and the lizardmen who died attempting to rise to the top in turn, slowly became a rampart that led up to the wall itself. And on these dead and dying, the lizardmen began to rise. Foremost among them came Kukuzuzu, his white bone armor fending off every blow, and his fellow lizardmen began to follow him to the top, his fists deflected blows, his tail lashed with fury. "Kill frogmen," he bellowed his rage out, snatching spears that missed his body and yanking so hard that the frogmen flew from the walls and fell into the mass of lizardmen whose clubs and spears quickly ended the screams of pain the fallen let out. Hiketi recognized the threat he posed to the wall when her heavies confronted him, and their blows, for all their efforts, seemed to not harm him at all. Kukuzuzu's fist came out, and a frogman's head exploded in a spray of blood and brain matter that, ever so briefly, froze stiff all those who saw it. "Queen Hiketi challenges you," she bellowed instantly before another of her elites could fall. She didn't run, she jumped, her massive and powerful legs carrying her to soar over the battle area like a bird in flight, and cover her soul with despair at what she saw. The far side of her wall where her people remained was littered with the dead who had fallen to magic, stones, and spears, while the fresh lizardmen had few dead to show for it all as near as she could tell. She landed before the lizardman and snapped her spear down atop the wall. Her people cleared the way and the lizardman in white bone armor, and an idiot by her reckoning, held up his fist. "Kuku fights you," he bellowed, and the two rushed at one another. His fist was faster than it had any right to be, even being martially enhanced. Her spear deflected him only by the purest luck again and again. Her own martially enhanced body barely kept up. She landed blow after blow with her free-webbed palm, but his bone-wrapped armor caught the broad blows. His tail added to the fight. Every time he spun she had to leap, to avoid it. Back and forth they went, a brief truce coming between the two sides for the duel of champions, the queen versus the chief. Her towering height gave her reach, but his armor and strength was second to none. He stepped on the carpet of bodies as she forced him back away, only for him to advance again, threatening to grab her body or her spear. But such a close fight could not endure forever, and among the chiefs at the rear there was one singular moment of absolute horror when Hiketi's spear struck home, hitting the gap in his armor that only barely exposed his throat. Her spear opened up his throat, and Kuku fell backwards, toppling over the body, spraying a fountain of blood that stained the white bone armor as he tumbled into the now shattered but freezing places in the water with a sickening splash. Hiketi held up her spear. Hiketi strikes down the one lizard man chief with courage.